Michael Burry's latest tweet makes absolutely no sense. Don't get me wrong, Michael's made a lot of great predictions over the past 12 months that have turned out to be true regarding recessions, inflation, and growth stock valuations. But his latest take on how inflation could play out like it did in the 1970s makes zero sense in my opinion. I have a lot of data to share that completely counters the arguments he's making, and to be honest, this data will definitely help most investors make a better decision out of all the FUD that we're seeing on social media around 2023. But before we get into it, guys, make sure to drop me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. So the tweet in question is this one, where Michael did admit that inflation has peaked in the short term. CPI has come down from 9% to around 7%. But he believes that in the second half of this year, the CPI will start going negative. And then because of the Fed cutting interest rates, we will have another inflation spike, possibly in 2024. Now, the reason why this is interesting is because this is something that happened back in the 1970s. And although on paper what he just said makes a lot of sense, if you actually look at all the nuances, the data, and the external factors of the 1970s, you'd realize that the situation today in 2023 is completely different. Let me share just a couple of reasons for why that is the case. Number one, unemployment today is at 4%. Unemployment back in the 1970s was north of 10 to 15%. There was a reason why the government back then was trying to increase inflation by spurring economic growth, because they wanted unemployment to come down. The Fed actually went through 3 different chairmen in the 80s and the 70s, which led to completely different forms of policies. You had Arthur Burns in the start of the 70s, and then you had Paul Volcker that came out in 1979 that raised interest rates from 10 to 20%, which obviously led to this massive decline in CPI. And it's extremely well known that back in the 1970s, the Fed did not use interest rates as a way to tame inflation. The president back then, Nixon, actually wanted inflation to be higher and interest rates to be as low as possible, because he obviously had a massive agenda to bring down unemployment and put America back on the map to growth. Because what happened in the 1970s was the Bretton Woods Agreement, which separated the gold from the dollar, which obviously destroyed economic growth. And guess what? We don't have anything like this happening today in 2022. The Bretton Woods Agreement completely separated the US dollar from other currencies and resulted in some massive speculation to the downside, which also ended up fueling the oil embargo of 1975, which resulted in oil prices skyrocketing 4x. Yes, back in 1973, we actually had an oil shock. Unlike today, even with the Ukrainian war, the United States does not have an oil shock. Right now, prices are up 70 to 50% from 2021, but they're nowhere near up 400% like we saw back in 1973. There was actually a gas shortage back then where pumps were filled up with lines, and most gas pumps had no gas left after a few days of operation. And obviously that was a big cause for inflation going out of control in the 1970s. Today we actually have an OPEC agreement, and we have a lot of capacity from the shale oil industry here in the US for bringing oil online when there is a price spike. We've already seen that happen with oil prices coming down to the level that they were at the start of 2022 before the Ukrainian war. And so the situation is completely different from what Michael Burry and other people are mentioning about the second inflation cycle coming up, because obviously we've already seen that take place in the 1970s. And what's really interesting about what happened in the 1970s is that back then President Nixon actually put in wage and price controls, meaning they wanted to suppress the growth of prices because President Nixon did not want to be blamed for causing a recession by raising interest rates. Isn't that a big contrast to what's going on today? Today, Jerome Powell and even Biden don't care about if we go into a recession like we're already going into right now. They just want inflation to be out of the consumer of the US, and they want to bring down prices as fast as possible, because obviously that's a bad look for the government. And obviously a big reason for that was back in the 1970s, unemployment was much higher than it is today, and it was growing at a much faster pace than it is today. This is something people tend to forget. Unemployment was spiked in the pandemic, which was an instant shock to the entire system. This rise in unemployment and the stimulus checks drove this inflation. This was not driven by actual policy, the Bretton Woods Agreement, or oil shocks. This was driven by a once-in-a-100-year event by the name of the pandemic, in which the government ended up giving out too much money to the average consumer and printed too much money in the form of the M2 money supply. And so the inflationary spike that we've seen is likely just temporary. It is not a longer-term systemic problem unless obviously the Fed decides that it wants to be a complete idiot and cut rates too early and start handing out stimulus checks once again. Not only did we also have the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which helped spike inflation even faster, but we also have energy being a much higher component of most household budgets back then. Today, energy is a significantly less part of the component because technology is a deflationary thing. Technology has evolved significantly since the 1970s, and it has led for the valuations of companies to go up, but it has also led for the M2 money supply and the GDP to go up. And as we all know, as the GDP goes up, the economic stability of the country increases and the average standard of living also goes up. The deflationary aspect of the technology sector of the S&P 500 is more than evident with the dividend yield that we've seen from 1950 to 2022. In the 1970s, dividend yields actually skyrocketed, and that is actually a bad thing because it shows that people are rushing towards safer assets because of companies that are more dependent on external factors. And today, that is simply not the case. The US has many more domestic companies like Microsoft, Apple, and Google, these mega caps that are absolutely destroying the game when it comes to technology. And technology is deflationary because it makes life easier for people and it reduces the incremental output that most companies need to give based on a certain criteria of input. And because of this insane urge by presidents in the 1970s to spur economic growth, even when Jimmy Carter came out, the third president of that decade, he said he did not want to fight inflation with economic growth. He wanted people to just spend less money and not actually raise interest rates, which was obviously a bad decision because it hurted the overall US growth and economy. Because of the insane stimulus back then, money supply grew by 78% in the 1970s, and it wasn't until Chairman Volcker came in that he decided that getting inflation under control was much more important than jobs. And as a result, he raised interest rates, which crashed the economy in the short term, but it helped bring down inflation, which was much more of a severe problem. And guess what? Unlike what many people make it out to be, that massive correction of inflation was not actually bad for the stock market. As you can see, back in 1979 is when that massive interest rate hike happened. And then in the early 1980s is when inflation started to collapse from around 14% all the way down to 3%. And as you can see, the stock market went down only a mere 25 to 30% in that time, which obviously was not that bad compared to what happened in the early 1970s with the initial inflation spike. So even if we were to get this massive second run in inflation, the market is going to already have priced in a lot of the pain beforehand, and the further decline in the market is not going to be any worse. And as you can see, between those two spikes, the S&P 500 already recovered like most of its losses from that initial bear market, and it actually breached the previous high. So even if Michael Burry is correct in the second inflationary spike because of a Fed policy mistake, it does not necessarily mean the stock market's going to underperform. There's still going to be many opportunities to make money, and this is not going to be a reason for you to sell out of your positions. As a matter of fact, you can see during the time that the Fed was actually raising rates, the market actually did pretty well, going up more than 30%. And what many people tend to forget is that back in the 1970s, the Fed was a lot less vocal about its moves. Today, the Fed is a lot more open with forward-looking guidances in every FOMC meeting they give, meaning they literally hand you out what they expect inflation and the Fed funds rate to actually be, meaning it's a lot easier for the market to price that in ahead of time. And that obviously is the reason why the Fed funds rate back in the 80s and 70s was so volatile, which also resulted in the stock market seeing massive up and down cycles. And as you can see, there were three major macroeconomic events that really led to the second cycle back then, which is something we're not seeing today. And hopefully I expect that the Fed has learned from the mistakes that were made back then to not repeat it today. I mean, there's a reason why the 2008 crisis did not turn into another Great Depression. The Federal Reserve and the US government learned from what happened in 1931 to prevent that kind of Great Depression from happening again. And similar today in the 2022 recession, chances are the market's going to realize what happened in the 1970s and it's going to try to avoid happening that again. Now, obviously, there could be external factors that make Michael Burry's case even more of a reality, but that is not my job to predict. Given the current data and the situation that we're in today, I think Michael Burry's prediction is really out of this world. But obviously, guys, that is just my take on the situation, so let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below.